In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Vanadium. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This ink is picky about what pen it's in. Choose the wrong pen and it's too light to comfortably use for a whole page of writing. We get a very light, slightly blue-leaning purple from it. On cream paper, though, it is very passable as a blue. Thankfully, there is tone variation by pen, and otherwise you might get stuck with the lighter tone that you'll see in the writing samples. It does show shading, but only really with the darker version of it. Now, I'm going to say only really, even though I am going to point out some spots where it shades with some of the lighter tone, but it's so much lighter and kind of painful to read that while it's there, it's not anything that's special to me. Really, this is just something that needs to be darker to really be usable. Now, I do know that some people like these lighter, dustier tones. I want to say this is slightly dusty as a tone. Some people really do like these lighter tones, so I'm going to try not to bash it too much. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Levenger TrueWriter with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the posting nib, you see that this is very light. Now we get no feather, we get no spread. Technically, we can see some spots of shading. You see the middle of the second 3 on the top line is a little darker, the H of which is a little darker, where the T crosses into the H of although it also gets a little darker. So there is the ability to do some shading here, it's just that it's too light for me. The Aero Fine nib is thankfully a bit darker than the posting nib, which, to be honest, that is very narrow and very dry. Now, it's not feathering here, it's not spreading, it is giving a little bit more shading than we had with the posting nib, though even with that, I want to say that on the majority I find this tone too light to really comfortably read as a whole page, although I can read it. Looking at the Architect nib, it is darker than we had with the Fine. It does not feather. It does not spread. That sloppiness that you see on the first word system, that was me. That wasn't anything with the ink. It shades fairly well. I actually want to say it shades really well here. Just about every word you can see it. From complete on the top line going lighter to darker, to irrational on the second line going lighter to darker again. Much nicer in how this looks. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We can easily write back here. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a TWSBI Vac Mini with a posting nib, a TWSBI Eco with an Aero nib that is fine, a TWSBI Mini with an Architect, The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the posting nib, I'm hoping that this is showing up on camera. Hopefully. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is just about as light. It's about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we do get, I want to say, a little bit more in terms of what the shading going on than we did with the Clairfontaine, which is a little surprising. Looking at the Aero Fine, it is slightly lighter than we had with the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we do get shading, about as much shading as we had on the Clairfontaine. It definitely shows itself very well. You can see it in the word positive, where the cross of the T or the E on the end are much darker than the rest of the words. Same with the rational underneath. The cross of the T, much darker. So when you back over letters a second time, you start to get some darker tones. Looking at the Architect nib, as has been the case on this paper, it is a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, we're not getting any kind of feathering or any kind of spread. It does shade. I want to say it doesn't shade as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, though it is shading very well. I think if you were using an Architect nib on this paper with this ink, if you're a print writer, I think it would actually look very nice. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the last paper, which is just a little lighter than that Clairfontaine. We're not getting any kind of feathering. We're not getting any kind of spread. I think the shading is showing up a bit better here than it did on some of the other papers. The result of that is I actually find it slightly easier to read here than I did on the more white papers. This is just slightly off-white as a paper. Looking at the Aerofine nib, we get about the same tone that we had on the WritePad, which is a little lighter than the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, almost no shading, but there is little bits of it. As it was before, pretty much where your letters cross back over. So on the cross of T's, you start to see it get a little bit darker. On H's, you see it get a little bit darker when you get down at the bottom of the H. So it is there, showing it can happen. Looking at the Architect nib, it is about the same tone as the last paper, still a little bit lighter than the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread. The shading is not as good as it was on the WritePad, but it is not horrible. I do still think that if you were using an Architect nib on this paper with this ink as a print writer, it would look much better. Unfortunately, I really don't write in print almost ever. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem writing back here. Might have been a surprise if there was a problem. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, it is a little bit lighter than we had with the Clairfontaine. You know what? It's right about the same as that Clairfontaine, honestly. It's very light, very difficult to read. There is no feathering. There is no spread. There is some shading going on. I think there's a little more shade than there was with the Clairfontaine. Perhaps the more absorbent nature of this paper is really kind of helping it out. Looking at the Arrow Fine nib, we get very much the tone from the Clairfontaine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We do get some shading, a little more shading than we had with the Clairfontaine, and it shows itself much more frequently. So the tone variation, I think, is a little bit more in the shading. It goes to a little darker than it did there, and it happens more frequently, so it's a definite win. Looking at the Architect nib, it is, in general, a bit lighter than we had with the Clairfontaine. Now, we're not getting any feathering, and we're not getting any spread. We are getting some shading, nowhere near as much as we had with the Clairfontaine, about as much as we had with that FieldNotes, but it's certainly there another time where, if you're a print writer, I think it's going to look really nice on the page with this. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman number 13. Here is Caran d'Ache Ultraviolet. Here is Cross Violet. Here is Geherbon Violet Pence. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, we get a bit more of a blue lean here than we've had on a bunch of the others, which is kind of interesting because mostly I experienced that on the cream paper, but it is happening a bit here. Now, we're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any spread. Very interesting. We are getting, I think, quite a bit more shading than we had on any of the other papers when it comes to this posting nib. I tend to worry with this paper, and I'm hoping it didn't bleed. Looking at the Arrow Fine nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine, or about the same darkness, but more of a blue than the purple lean. There's still that purple on the Clairfontaine. It's really showing the blue here. It looks more like a blue anyway to me. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does give little bits of shading. It's not too bad. I want to take back some of the spread. I'm looking at the Clairfontaine side by side, and I think it spreads just a little. Looking at the Architect nib, we see that we get about the same tone that we did with the Arrow Fine, so much lighter than any of the other papers. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread, and I'm going to be honest, that is a real win for this ink and what's going on. It does give some shading and more in spots where you've stopped writing if you hesitate for a second before you lift the pen, which makes me worry about bleeding. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that there's quite a bit of ghosting. I'm not sure if you could use the back of this page well, but none of this bled through and touched the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a green ink by Levenger, their Forest. Here is a shimmering gray ink by Diamine, their Sparkling Shadow. Here is a pink ink by Private Reserve, their Shell Pink. Here is a yellow ink by Diamine, their Amber. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the posting nib, we get still that kind of blue from the last paper, not as much the purple. Now, we're not getting any kind of feathering. We're not getting any kind of spread. We are getting little bits of shading. Honestly, here it is doing exceptionally well considering how cheap this paper is. I'm very impressed with it and hope that it doesn't bleed through. Looking at the Aerofine nib, which does write a bit lighter than that posting nib. Now, we are getting tiny bits of feathering. You see it in the word complex on the first line. There is the tiniest bit of spread, but both of them are well manageable in what's there. Now, I'll give it that it's got a little bit of shading because you do see a couple darker spots. Like in that word complex, the EX is a little darker than the rest of the word. Geometry, the TRY look a little darker than the rest of the word, so I guess it is there. Looking at the Architect nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the Aerofine. It does feather a tiny bit. It does spread just the tiniest bit. Both are very manageable. It does give some shading, more shading than we had with the other inks. So you can sometimes, with the right pen and ink, get shading even on copy paper. Truly amazing. Looking at the back of the page, you see that while it does spot heavily, it did not come through and touch the page underneath. Ghosting is fairly under control, though using the back of the page is user discretion. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? Technically, I can read it from drier fine nibs, but my eyes hurt after a lot of reading and writing with it. So I really prefer this from a wet to a very wet pen, preferably a broad. And that's to thicken the lines and help it be much more readable. The fact that it really brings out the shading that this ink can do is an added benefit. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, do all that YouTubery stuff. Thanks for watching.